Executive Committee. We now come to order. We are convened as of 11:15 a.m. I'd respectfully ask everyone attending this meeting to mute yourself unless you're recognized to speak. Please note that committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors will be held remotely via Zoom and will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of the meetings, will be posted as soon as practical on the board's website. During today's meeting, we are providing Communication Access Real-Time Translation, also known as CART. Anyone who'd like to access this service should send an email to the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com, and a link will be provided. Additionally, the CART transcript can be automatically translated into Spanish for anyone who'd like access to a live transcript of this meeting in Spanish. A live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. I'd now like to call the roll of committee members. First Vice Chair O'Keefe.
Present.
Second Vice Chair Whitmore.
Present.
Secretary Nicholson.
Present.
Treasurer Banker.
I'm here.
And I am present. So that is 5 of us present. I do want to, for the sake of the record, note that Director Catlin is also joining us. And I believe that is all the other non-committee members. So thank you for joining us. All right, I would like to open public comment to anyone who'd like to address the committee regarding any topic listed in the published meeting agenda for the current and immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and have not already done so, please either raise your virtual hand or press star 9 on your phone. During this time, the committee will not offer any direct comments or responses. However, if you'd like to be contacted regarding your public comment, please email the RTD board office at rtd.directors@rtd-denver.com. Please bear in mind, staff will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. If you're dialed in, press star 6 to toggle your mute settings. Please bear in mind that by participating in this process, you're being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, then your comments will need to be submitted via writing. Comments can be submitted to the board office at the following email address, rtd.directors@rtd-denver.com. Speakers should begin their remarks by stating their names, and each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak. Mr. Kroll, do we have any speakers today? Pardon me.
Chairman Bouquet, this is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. While we've had 3 individuals join as attendees, none of those individuals have raised their hand at this juncture in indication that they wish to provide public comment. And in anticipation of your subsequent question, no specific emailed or written comments were received specific to this meeting in advance.
All right. With that being said, with no public comment, I will now close the queue for public comment at this time. All right. Now moving forward, we are now on to our May board meeting agenda review. As a reminder, the board and the public who may be watching later on, our May board meeting will be held Wednesday, May 28th, due to the Memorial Day holiday. So it will not be our typical Tuesday night. Considering the Access on Demand program modifications were added to the board agenda by the Operations Safety and Security Committee as a discussion item, I'd like to move the item up to earlier in this evening after the external entity report. Are there any members who would object to this item being moved on the agenda? Okay. Okay, seeing no objection, is there a motion to approve the board meeting agenda as amended for a meeting on Wednesday, May 28th?
So moved, Whitmore.
A second?
Second.
I have Whitmore as the mover and Nicholson as the second. Is there any discussion on this? Okay. Are there any no votes on this? All right. Well, with no votes, that will pass with 5 yes, 0 no's, and 0 absent. There are 3 discussion items on today's agenda. The first item is our monthly government relations report. Before I give it over to Mr. Davies, I would like to note that for today's meeting, for everyone to be aware, it does look like Ms. Johnson had a last-minute commitment that they had to take. And so Mr. Pena will be serving in Ms. Johnson's role today. So did want to make the note of that before we move forward. Okay, with that moving on, Mr. Davies, our government relations officers, would you like to please present this monthly government relations report?
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the committee. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. Got a brief government relations report for you. Starting at the federal level, Congress has really been focused on their reconciliation and budget package, which has moved through the House at this point. I think most notably is the portion of that package that relates to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which did all of the committees of jurisdiction largely marked up their portions of the larger reconciliation and budget package. With regards to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I think in a lot of ways, good news for transportation in some sense, in that there was not significant cuts to the programs within the Highway Trust Fund, formula programs funding that RTD relies on. Those are largely held whole in many ways because of the Highway Trust Fund and the structure of how federal funding flows for transportation. So, and one of, I think, the notable additional good news with regards to how the House Transportation Committee is looking at the reconciliation package is that they're taking a forward-looking view as to how they can add new revenues to the Highway Trust Fund, which is really crucial when Congress starts to mark up the surface transportation reauthorization bill, which expires in October, September 30th, 2026. So Congress is starting that process now to look at that, but they're on their revenue side of things. The reconciliation package really is the opportunity for Congress to look at some of those revenues. And so really for the first time in decade at this point, really looking, well, multiple decades at this point, looking to add new revenues into the Highway Trust Fund. And that is largely a fee on EVs and hybrids that has been absent in the past. So I just say that is that when at least Congress is looking at the new revenue side of things, because largely since 2009, the Highway Trust Fund has not kept up with the spending in the surface transportation bills. So they've had to do essentially a general fund transfer to feed the Highway Trust Fund and make those bills whole for their 5 and 6 year periods of time. So this is just a step toward adding some new revenues to that on top of the federal gas tax, which of course hasn't been adjusted since about 1993. Additionally, at the federal level, myself, GM CEO Johnson, and a couple of our board members had an opportunity to participate in the APTA legislative conference held really starting this weekend and held earlier this week in Washington, D.C. Really allowed us a great opportunity to visit with our congressional offices. It was a great opportunity to hear from Secretary Duffy, to hear from our acting administrator at the Federal Transit Administration, and then an opportunity when meeting with our congressional delegation to talk about the importance of formula funding and how that impacts RTD's ability to do state of good repair work, and talk about important bus grants and bus facilities that are really important, just grant opportunities for this agency and will be important in the future. And then lastly, be able to touch on that revenue side of things and the 80-20 split. And so, as many of you may know, the gas tax that goes into the Highway Trust Fund and the general fund dollars that are transferred over to the Highway Trust Fund, those are split 80% to highway funding, 20% to transit funding, and maintaining that historical split with new revenues is really important. So for example, going back to what I just mentioned on the EV fees and hybrid fees, to maintain that historical 80-20 split with new revenues going in is really important to the transit industry as a whole. And it was a good opportunity to be able to talk with our congressional offices about those specific points. Moving to the state, as you all know, the 2025 legislative session did come to an end on May 7th. Clearly one of the most impactful and bills that will clearly require RTD to take many steps into the future here, not just for a year, but several years into the future, was Senate Bill 25-161 transit reform. Does have a number of deadlines and requirements for RTD to take action on. So that bill was signed by the governor on Tuesday, May 13th. Staff is really taking the time now to go through, analyze, and build out what each department that would be responsible for some of these items in that bill and what it's going to take to implement that on the staff side of things. Lastly, in the written report, I give a breakdown of the Clean Transit Enterprise and the latest work that has happened there. The Clean Transit Enterprise has developed a general formula for being able to put out last year's revenues created in SB 230. This is the oil and gas revenues that will be available for transit agencies really at the beginning of 2026. But CTE is making good progress in developing that formula. So we'll continue to watch that at the staff level to understand the application process and further requirements, and are working really closely with the CTE as they really work internally to develop those kind of details. Last thing I would mention, just with regards to going back to Senate Bill 161 transit reform. Of course, I think the appointment process is one of those requirements that the RTD board needs to know about. August 1st, 2025 is when the appointments to the new accountability committee must be made. RTD's board, of course, has one non-voting member on the current board that will serve on that accountability committee. Otherwise, I have been in touch with the Colorado Energy Office, who is really charged with doing procurement and standing up the accountability committee. They're really just at the beginning stages of that right now. So no timeline has been developed. No process for a procurement for a facilitator or a consultant to handle that has been developed. So I will continue to work closely with them and keep the board up to date as those details come out, and as the Energy Office kind of works to really implement their portion of 161. And then lastly, I'll just touch on the local level, and this is really earlier this week. Our local government affairs contractor continued to work and arrange engagement opportunities with our local elected officials, and a couple of our board members and staff had an opportunity earlier this week on Tuesday, May 20th, to participate in a discussion session with the Jefferson County supervisors. And while I was not there to attend that, I understand it was a good and fruitful discussion. And with that ends my remarks, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davies. Secretary Nicholson.
Thank you. So, with regard to 161, there's a provision in there regarding eco passes and the significant requirement for us to develop a survey by the end of the year, and then start working with apartment buildings next year to survey every single apartment building in the district with over 50 units. I know that you said that staff has started to work on this process. What does our time, in order to get that kind of software ready? I mean, we go through procurement processes that take months. What kind of timeline does that look like in order for us to have something that is reliable, good, professional, et cetera? And, have we started thinking about whether that's something we're going to build ourselves or go out externally and purchase?
Mr. Davies.
Yes, thank you, Director Nicholson, for the question. That is largely those are the details that our staff is really working out at this point. I will say, my understanding is that we do have a survey already developed, and we've used that as a part of our NecoPass process in the past. So I think in many ways we're ahead of the game on that portion of it. I will note that RTD itself does not have any requirements to survey the buildings. That is really the charge and the direction of the building owner to do those surveys. RTD is not charged in the bill with actually conducting the surveys. Our requirement is to publicly post and make available the survey by beginning of the year, as you noted. So maybe just an understanding piece on what it will take to do those surveys, but that's really the responsibility of the building owner to do those surveys for their residents, not RTD.
Secretary?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I may have conflated us being required to reach out to and facilitate with actually performing. And it sounds like when you say we have a survey, is that like a digital or is that like a piece of paper, kind of like just to understand there? And if you don't know, that's fine.
Mr. Davies?
Yeah, unaware of exactly in what form that is and how we've conducted those in the past for previous NecoPass contracts, etc. But I think that's the portion of at least that EcoPass section of the bill that staff will be working to develop and make sure that we adhere to the requirements in the bill.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you both. Any further comments or questions from Mr. Davies? All right. Well, Mr. Davies, I just wanted to say a big thank you for this legislative cycle and, all involved. Do you want to give a shout out to first vice chair and second vice chair, Directors O'Keefe and Director Whitmore for being our government liaisons for this cycle? I know this was definitely a lot of work and a lot of weekend phone calls and, last minute decisions being made. So just wanted to give a shout out for the two of you for being our directors during this this cycle. So, and again, thank you, Mr. Davies, for all the work that you do. Always greatly helps us. So thank you, sir. All right, with seeing no other comments or questions for Mr. Davies, we're now going to move on to our second of three discussion items, and that is in regards to the review of directors' expenses and reimbursement policy. I'll now give this over to Mr. Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office, to present this item.
Thank you, Chair Bouquet. This is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. I'm delighted to come before you all today with some initial proposed revisions to the board's expense and reimbursement policy. You all last took a look at this in the fall of 2023 with changes that were enacted in November of that year and took effect in January of 2024. The goal of the changes we are proposing here for input and further review is to really better align the board's travel practices and expense practices with that at the agency. And so really trying to drive some greater alignment as well with IRS timelines for reimbursement by way of heightened accountability. Currently, and this was a change that was made in 2023 that took effect in 2024, we added language to the policy, or the board rather added language to the policy that indicated, if a director was kind of chronically late submitting their expenses, they may have to go through executive committee to receive reimbursement. The language being proposed here, and again, this isn't an action item, just discussion, is for directors to be required to effectively go get that permission if it's past these stated IRS guidelines. We've seen a lot of increased compliance with the deadlines in the policy that since the changes in 2023, again, that took effect in 2024, set certain dates, but we used to just get, close to a year's worth of expenses in December from certain corners of the board, which you can imagine just puts a massive strain on staff time and resources at the end of the year as we're closing out the books. So we've seen progress in this area, but we want to just create some further accountability. And again, that aligns with what staff at the agency are expected. If I were to go and submit an expense report that was outside of the timelines prescribed by the IRS, I would have a hard time getting reimbursed as well. And so I think that's just creating some equity there. We've had some issues in recent years with directors canceling travel at the last minute and just setting forward some provisions that if that's kind of a frequent, you kind of know the line when you see it. The board may ask that director to, in effect, simply book their travel on their own and be reimbursed. So it's not limiting that director's ability to be reimbursed, but really shifting the obligation from staff to directors. You can imagine staff invests a lot of time, energy, and effort into getting these arrangements booked. And if someone's just kind of frequently skipping travel or canceling it for whatever reason, you can see how, we've got some sunk costs there with staff time and what we've been devoted to. And there's some language cleanup around establishing new sections for business equipment and business communications. So we used to refer to that as IT expenses, but that was overly broad. And so we're narrowing, or we're dividing that section up and indicating this is your business equipment section, this is what you will be provided, this is the strings that are attached to what you're provided, and then business communication is that no more than $140 reimbursement for phone and internet expenses that each director is eligible for. The other thing, we had an instance come up with some of the transition of board members last year as they transitioned off the board, and just really clarifying that any equipment that is provided to directors directly from the agency or for which directors are reimbursed for purchasing has to be turned in at the end of that director's term. I think reasonably several outgoing directors requested the ability to simply purchase those devices from RTD, but from a IT governance, system security perspective, document retention perspective, that just posed a lot of problems. And so we're just simply clarifying that that is not an option for directors. Backing up to travel, the staff goes through a fairly rigorous process to request travel. And while the expense and reimbursement policy, set some expectations that directors get their travel pre-approved, we're just fleshing that out a little bit more, putting some more meat on that bone as to exactly what that means. This also streamlines the ability for the board office to make those arrangements on behalf of directors. And the final thing I'll say on this, and happy to take any questions that board members may have from reviewing the red line draft here, is that the board approved the audit plan, internal audit plan for this next year earlier in your meeting cycle. And one of the audits that is slated to come forward in June is actually an audit of board members' expenses. And that's a good thing to do. We should be taking a look at this. But why we're not committing necessarily to our normal time frame of here's the recommended changes, we'll come back next month with a recommended action after receiving input, is we actually want to wait as a board office to see what additional changes the auditors may recommend after their review of the last few years of board office expenses or board member expenses and reimbursements. And then we would combine those changes or recommended changes with whatever consensus we have on the changes we're proposing here and any additional changes that directors may want to propose. And we would bring that item back in the fall for approval by the board and executive committee. And then any changes, unless the auditors, I think, declare them absolutely vital to take effect immediately, any changes that we would make to this policy would take effect just as they did with the last round of revisions starting in January of 2026. And that way everyone's kind of playing by the same set of rules for a full calendar and no one's having kind of the rules changed mid-year. And so with that, Chairman Bouquet, I'm happy to take any questions or comments on these proposed changes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll. Secretary Nicholson.
Thank you. So I will say thank you for your incredibly hard work on this, Mr. Kroll. I read the whole thing and it was clearly well thought out. With regard to the pre-authorization section, as I read it, every single travel request would require pre-authorization. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So the reason that I asked that is that there are some trips, like the legislative trip that just happened, or the board summit in Kansas City, or other APTA stuff, where the board office basically emails us out and says, "Do you want to go on this?" Are we going to be required to get pre-authorization for those trips?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that we're just fulfilling the role of, hey, these are things that we believe would be beneficial for you all to attend in your capacity as directors. But as far as identifying the flights, the hotel, et cetera, that you wish to stay at, those would be things we would need to have in hand and approved prior to booking any travel. And in part, that's because of the various costs that may be associated with staying at the conference hotel, or if the conference hotel is booked, staying off site. We just want to make sure we have record that, when you're getting approved to travel, you're also in effect getting approved to travel within a certain means.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So everybody is going to have to go to the chair and basically say, "Here's what I want for this trip," and get that signed off on and stuff. And then, okay, cool.
Exactly.
That's cool.
And then also, it also does the work of streamlining the travel planning process on our end for the board.
Mhm.
If we know the exact flights and the exact hotel accommodations that directors are looking for, we can book those much easier than having to do the legwork of figuring out which flights that you might want and corresponding in that way, and just kind of shifting a little bit of that work onto the directors from the board office. And I think, given the tools that are at everyone's fingertips in 2025 here with respect to planning travel, I think that's a reasonable shift.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Treasurer Banker?
Hey, Jack, a quick question. I see you've got about, I'm guessing, 20 pages in this packet that just lists. Could you talk to that? It looks like it's going back to the 1990s. These are all the documents that you're retaining?
Oh, I believe that's for the next discussion item, Treasurer Banker.
Okay.
Any questions? Okay, we'll wait for the next discussion item on that one then, Treasurer. In regards to the current expense and reimbursement policy. Okay, seeing none. Did want to say just thank you, Mr. Kroll, for all of your work on this. This, I think, just is going to help clean up things. And again, I think we're at a point where there's a lot more efficiency as we study more and more of our policy matters. And when it comes down to, stuff just as simple, or potentially not as simple, but when it comes to our expense and reimbursement policy. So just wanted to thank you and all those involved. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could, Chairman,
Yeah.
just give a
Yeah.
shout out to the board office staff, Tyshree Parrish, Julian Knapp Rhodes, and Marie Snell. I mean, while I presented a lot of what was being proposed here, they're the ones that do not only the hard work of actually assisting directors with their travel and making those arrangements and submitting your expense reports for approval. They're also the ones, because they do that hard work, that have the best insights as to what can be improved in this process. So a lot of credit goes to them.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marie, Tyshree, and Jillian, for always your continued work. Sometimes our unsung heroes. Okay, moving on to our third and final item, and that is going to be the board office record retention update. And Mr. Kroll, I'll give it back to you to present this item.
Great. So yes, the board office has been, let me back up. When I joined the board office in June of 2023, Tyshree Parrish really flagged this issue of document retention as one that we needed to focus on as an office. Not just because it was kind of an important matter, but also because it happened to coincide with a broader focus by the agency on document retention. And, we're an office of 4 folks, and so we kind of have to shift our attention to what's most urgent. And so we've not forgotten about this project, but instead made steady progress on it since last we updated you all in the spring of last year. Really, the aim with this project is to modernize the board's record retention practices. You know, it does indicate in the board's bylaws that the secretary is responsible for, you know, maintaining and having access to board records, but in effect, you know, the secretary is you know, just a director who knock to our current secretary, but you all don't have the same amount of time and resources to do these types of things. So in effect, the board office maintains records on behalf of the directors and the board. And we've really been diligent over the last year in cleaning up those records, removing a lot of duplicate records. So we had reams and reams of duplicate records that were actually being held elsewhere in the agency. A great example of this is expense records. So we had those, but so did finance, which is the actual recognized depository for those records. And so cleaning those out from our system. We also want to, you know, keep you all aware, and those of you who have been on the board for a while are aware that we are in the process of replacing our board agenda and meeting management software, which is reaching end of support in September of this year and end of life in September of 2027. And so we're working diligently to find a replacement for IQM2. And you may be wondering, what's IQM2? Well, that is the website that you all go to download the board packets and look up the board history. So we've got to get some cleanup done here on those items. And the reason why it's important to have good record retention practices is every vendor that we've discussed, you know, that could be a potential replacement to IQM2 has always asked us, well, what amount of records are you going to be carrying over from your current system? And that is not a service that is necessarily provided for free. And so we just are really looking to hone our practices so that we can have a clear answer and a clear understanding for what we're going to be carrying forward. We are, you know, the agency it's not breaking the bank by any means, but there's about 264 boxes of board office and board records located off-site. It's a nominal fee of about $600 to store those on an annual basis. But one of the things that I should caveat that with is if we were to be asked to produce those records, we would be obligated to do so, and then we would incur a fee to both retrieve the records from the offsite storage and re-put them in storage. And so what we did as a way of potentially, you know, maintaining the public's access to those documents, but really removing them from RTD's obligations, is we approached the state archives, and they indicated a strong interest in obtaining the physical records of board meeting minutes, agendas, and actions. And I would encourage us to continue to pursue that route for not only the nominal cost savings, but more importantly, the state archives is just that. They're an archives. They are professionals that can review and evaluate these documents, catalog them, and actually create a heightened level of public accessibility to them, as opposed to them, you know, being cataloged in an Excel sheet with us and stored in an offsite space. In my perspective, that actually creates broader public access to that information than we currently are providing. And what you will see here in the board report is our proposed retention period for these key items that the board office partners or either maintains ourselves or partners with different offices across the agency to maintain. And you can see here that meeting minutes, meeting agendas and packets, meeting transcripts, board actions and resolutions, we are intending to keep those forever. Those will never disappear. We will digitize copies of those in most instances, and then over time we'll work out an arrangement with the state archives that, you know, indicates, you know, any physical copies of these items would be shared with them. Meeting recordings, 10 years for those, and in conversations with General Counsel's office, they felt, you know, matching executive session recordings with 10 years 10 years, I'll tell you the legal obligation on keeping meeting recordings per the IGM schedule here is 6 months. Obviously, I think there's a strong public interest in maintaining recordings of board meetings for a longer period of time. But again, we have recordings stored on CDs going back into the early 2000s on tape cassettes. And at some point, the medium upon which those documents are stored breaks down. I mean, a CD only has so long of a life before the data that is stored on it is no longer really accessible. And so just setting certain standards there so that we're not creating a false sense of expectation that these records are accessible when the underlying medium has disintegrated effectively. And director expenses. So this one's a little bit odd. I'll just walk you through it. So we keep all expenses at the agency's records for 7 years, does the finance department. So you could imagine that a director serving for 2 years or for 2 terms, we wouldn't want a situation where there was an inquiry into how a director had spent their monies and the answer was, well, we only keep those for 7 years. So, the first year of their term, we don't have those records anymore. I think there's a good argument from a public interest perspective that we should keep those records at least through the director's term plus 1 year in case there wanted to be any inquiry backwards on what those expenses were. And then director emails. This is something that also came up as we transitioned board members this year from being active directors to being former directors. We only keep emails at the agency, and this is sort of an agency-wide policy for basically 3 years. And so what we're proposing is that we would hold on to copies of director emails for the length of their term plus 3 years afterwards. So again, creating some greater level of accessibility. One thing I will note on that is that just because that's what we're deciding to do or proposing to do here in this schedule, does not preclude a director from keeping their own emails, right? So if you had interest in downloading those files, which we did have an outgoing director do so, that would be something that you would want to have a conversation with the general counsel's office on your way out the door as a director to ensure that you were keeping those records in a safe place, especially any privileged communications. And so with that, I think that sums up our report for you all today. And I see Director or Secretary Nicholson has a question, and I'm happy to take his and any others on this matter.
Secretary.
Well, I wanted to defer to Treasurer Banker because she asked a question under the previous item, and I don't feel the need to go first every single time. So if Treasurer Banker wants to jump in, she is more than welcome to do so, and I'll go after.
Director Banker, would you like to go first?
Yeah, of course. A couple of questions here. So if you could explain the 20-page listing that you've provided. I recognize a lot of the names from the 1990s. So that's one question. Question number 2, for example, we were talking about accessoride earlier. So here's a question. We passed accessoride back in the 1990s. If we needed information as to how we did it, how quickly would you be able to pull that kind of information up? Question number 3, if we wanted all the resolutions regarding accessoride over the years, do you have access to that?
Those are all great questions. To answer the first question, the inventory list that was provided, it's a PDF of an Excel document, is a list of the 264 boxes that we have attributed to the board office in offsite storage. And so that's, you can see a general description of what's in each box in the, I think, 3rd column on that spreadsheet. So that's what that is. As far as being able to look up previous resolutions and actions, we absolutely have the capacity to do that. We store, even though these are physical copies, we actually have digital copies of all of these records. Okay. And I made allusions to, sending physical copies over to the state archives. And that is something we do intend to do, again, for purposes of creating greater public awareness of what's in those archives. But we are ensuring before we send any box out the door we are ensuring that we have a digital copy of what's in those boxes before we send it, of any board actions, board meeting minutes, etc. And then the Laserfiche database that all of those items are stored in digitally does have a search function. It is not the most robust search function, but if you spend time with it, you can go back and identify using keyword searches previous meetings in which actions were taken on a given topic. So certainly, like, we could go in there and find the resolutions and actions related to Access-a-Ride by using that database.
And I assume that would be fairly tedious.
It is, but that's a service that the board office, provides for not only directors, but also others across the agency who may want to ask. You could imagine staff is developing a board report. They may want to know, what previous board actions were on these topics, and we're absolutely capable and willing to assist them in that research.
So it's not just a couple of keystrokes where you'd be able to pull it out. It would probably take several hours.
Yeah, it can depending on the topic and how far back we want to go.
Okay, thank you.
Secretary Nicholson.
Oh, thank you. So a couple of clarifying questions. The 264 boxes, so we have digital copies of all of those records. Are there any other records that we have that we don't have digitized that we could potentially lose under this retention schedule?
Yeah, let me be clear. That's a great question, Secretary Nicholson. We are looking to digitize what we believe to be a reasonable set of records for the board, and this aligns with what the archives are looking for. So we sent this entire list of 264 boxes to the archives to get their input as to what they might like to take on, and they, of course, on their end, are also limited by space constraints and resource constraints. And they indicated to us they were only interested in keeping things related to board actions. So that's your meeting packets, your agendas, your minutes of those meetings, transcripts of those meetings, although the transcripts are a somewhat more new invention, or not invention, but element to the records of the board's meetings. What they were, say, for example, not interested in were, boxes that we had containing old photos, or boxes that we had containing expense reports from directors, who are long since off the board, or say even correspondence between directors. We have several boxes that contain, say, a given director's correspondence from, say, 1983 or something along those lines. So those were items that they were not necessarily interested in keeping. And I think, again, as we look to streamline these efforts, we're going to only keep those things for which the historical record is most paramount.
Okay, so will you come to us before you potentially destroy records? Because I'll tell you quite honestly, like, I'm a history buff myself, and I think that these are, I don't want to say priceless, but once we rip up photos from the 80s or documentation about for example, we're looking at Northwest Rail right now. That project started in 1987, if I remember correctly, with the first sort of version of that. And I could completely imagine someone in 5-10 years or whatever wanting to go back and trace the history of that project and see how we got to where we ended up from where we started, and wanting to see every memo, every photo, everything. And so I think it behooves us to have a conversation about how much would it cost to digitize everything that we have, so that we can get rid of all of those boxes and stop paying 600, whatever it is, and be able to hang on to that stuff. And I really highly prioritize that, because I think it would be a tragedy for us to be the board that tossed all that stuff in the fire, basically. And is that something that you can commit to, that you'll come to us before we start pulling that, where we start tossing that stuff?
Director Nicholson, I would be happy to engage further in that conversation, but I do think that that's the purpose of this
Yeah.
you know, update to you all is to indicate these would be the plans, in so much as, it is not as though we are instituting this standard, unawares of broader historical interest in these documents. In consulting with the archives, the state archives, that is, what they would recommend or want to keep, right, is just the official records. And in so much as, certain discussions were had, say, on Northwest Rail going back to 1987, so long as those things occurred within the context of a board meeting, which one could imagine there have been many board meetings discussing this item, those records would absolutely be preserved.
Yeah, let's have further conversations about this, because I really do want to make sure we don't toss into the garbage something that somebody, or other agencies or other whatever may really want in a decade that would not have cost us a ton of money to keep. I have friends who write history. There's history about 100 years ago in the state legislature that we only know about because people kept records from that period of time long past when the history around the correspondence around, maybe it wasn't an official board action, but it was a letter, an email, a photo, etc. So I understand the concern on your end, but I really do. I think we need to ask very careful questions before we throw out something that 20 years of your predecessors bothered to keep around. The second thing I want to address with regard to this is emails and other digital records, because a lot of correspondence. I was reading about my earliest predecessor, Jack McCroskey, who has all of his papers at, I think it's the Denver Library or one of the CU library. Yep. And I think that there's a pretty reasonable there's a significant value to giving directors the ability to retain, like you said, retain their emails. I think right now my emails get deleted in 3 years, and so I can download them, whatever. But I guess sort of with the same question, I want to make sure that we're not deleting things or removing things when they want to be kept. Like, I understand having policies and procedures to take care of things, but if we don't have to, and if directors are comfortable with their receipts, their records being kept, so that they can be submitted to a state archives or a library, I think that it behooves us to have a policy in place to retain those records. Otherwise, directors basically have to ask for regular you know what I mean? So I think that's a reasonable process, because I think there's huge value in those records from when they were, the way you can get them from 20 years ago. I wouldn't want us to get to a point where, because we're in a digital age, we actually have less information on the actions of individual directors, correspondents, whatever, than we did in 1990.
Yeah, to respond to that, I think the onus in what you're raising falls on the director to preserve those records. And there is, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing necessarily prohibitive in a director maintaining those records on their own. You mentioned Jack McCroskey's records being over at the Denver Public Library. So just a little bit of a history of my own self here is my father actually managed the Western History and Genealogy Department for the Denver Public Library. And a lot of what he dealt with in that role was archiving papers, records, if you will, of prominent individuals from across the state of Colorado. And how that process would work is the estate or the individual, as they were reaching the end of their lives, or perhaps had retired from their public career, would offer to the library the opportunity to take those papers. But the library was always weighing the expense of taking on those papers and the expense of archiving those papers with the historical value. And so they would go through and review those items and indicate certain items that they wish, that they thought be worthwhile to keep and indicate certain items which they just, weren't going to be able to keep. And there were many and many tough conversations between, my father and his staff and many estates and individuals around, you may believe this is particularly relevant, but, this is what we have found in our professional determination to do that. But again, the point I'm getting at here is that was really something that the individual endeavored to do, as opposed to any institution that individual had been associated with.
That totally makes sense. For me, it's just I don't want us to be actively deleting things that are, you know what I mean? Like if you guys are throwing stuff out or, have retention policies on my email, which I think you're changing to be 8 years instead of 3 years, for example, just that would make it harder for an individual director to do exactly what you're talking about. So I really appreciate you bringing this up. I think it's super important. Our ability to keep our own history. I've looked at those resolutions, you and I have worked on that, and there is a fantastic amount of information there. I would never have known that RTD at one point considered a helicopter service, for example, until I had looked over our previous resolution information. And I'm sure there's even more incredible things if we look back through everything else. So thank you for your work maintaining that. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
All right, moving on. I do see that for the sake of the record, Director Risha has joined us. And Director Risha, you are next up.
Thank you, Chair Bouquet. So I was watching I was watching the CART transcript actually, and I jumped on when I saw the archives topic come up because I wanted to offer a couple of things. First of all, every single director should have equal access to our archives and our Laserfiche system, and whatever is not digitized, we should all have access to. That's been denied to me in the past, and I think that needs to be remedied without delay. The second is that, with all due respect to staff's efforts on this, no one in our office has the qualifications of an archivist, irrespective of feedback we're getting or familiar relations, and nor would I. And I got a bachelor's in history. And so I am really uncomfortable with us moving forward as much as I want this project to get done without a clear plan outlined to the board. So, for example, accessibility. Our records have to be fully ADA accessible. We don't want to go back and redo something, that we spent a lot of money on so that we are compliant with the law, for example. Second, I am just reading from the transcript. It was noted that the agency was looking to digitize, what they believed was to be a reasonable set of records. And I'm quoting someone else's words. That's not my interpretation. And I can't speak for Director Nicholson because I can't say to how another person feels, but what Director Nicholson said struck a chord with me because I am in agreement that we need to have conversation about what that means, because for what someone else thinks might be reasonable, another person might feel is arbitrary or unreasonable. I mean, once those records are destroyed, they can't be retrieved. And so I would just say that, I also recognize this project is 5 years behind its original schedule, and not and I think I'm asking that the agency and the board office communicate to the entire board in writing, what the plan forward is and what the criteria will be for records retention, all records, and when those records might be destroyed. I can see the packet and I've read the transcript, but I think it is better for us to pause a second and make sure that we do this right, because we can't undo once we've done it. And sometimes, getting it done right is better than getting it done a little bit quicker. So I appreciate all the work that staff is putting into this. I but I felt it important enough to jump on the call and say on the record that we need to make sure that we're all on board, so to speak, before we move forward, because we can't go back once we've made these really big decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia. Mr. Kroll, any comments?
Yeah, I think what a good next step on this would be, obviously a big step in our process here is to get to the state archives certain digital record or certain physical records that they can archive that would then, alleviate our offsite storage needs and also increase the accessibility of those records to the public. I think that's a huge priority here in all of this, and I'm not seeing any or hearing necessarily any resistance to that approach. What I am hearing resistance to is the elimination of certain physical records that you all may deem, or several of you all may deem, to be valuable. And so what I can commit to in this process is, before any of that information is disposed of or thought to be disposed of, we can update the board on what that might be and get some further input on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Kroll. Director Ruscia?
Thank you, sir. So I don't want to misspeak for previous secretaries on the executive board, but it's my understanding that our last two secretaries did have some role in this conversation. And so I just wanted to offer, if we don't have one or two directors assigned, I think it's appropriate in both what the traditional secretary role is on a board, and what the traditional secretary role has been on this board, that perhaps Secretary Nicholson also work with staff on this matter, because I know it's 2025, but this would be something that would be squarely under the purview of a board secretary. Just generally, I think so. I don't want to voluntold another person for a project. I just want to offer it for the executive committee's consideration and for your consideration, Mr. Chair. If Secretary Nicholson can't do it, perhaps another board member could jump in. Thank you, and that concludes my comments on the topic.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. Secretary Nicholson, you were mentioned by name.
That's always fun. I would say, under the board bylaws and actually even under statute, I technically do have the responsibility for what's being done functionally in my name by our wonderful board staff. So, I'm not someone to pull rank here. I recognize that is very much in my name, not my job. But I would like to be very much involved actively, if for no other reason than technically I'm expected to be. So,
okay. I mean, as board chair, I'd be more than comfortable with it, Mr. Kroll, if you'd want to work with
Sure.
Secretary Nicholson on this. And I think it's more than appropriate. Director Ruscia and Director Nicholson provides some excellent feedback. And I think Director Nicholson, not only as your secretary role, but also as based on the feedback that you've given, I think you'd be the appropriate member to work with Mr. Kroll on this. With that being said, Secretary, did you have any other comments?
Not on this. I do have something for the next agenda item or a little bit later.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions in regards to this agenda item? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kroll, for presenting that. And of course, all involved with this, Ms. Tyshree Parrish, I believe you mentioned, was the first to bring this up. So I greatly appreciate Tyshree for bringing this topic to our attention, and Mr. Kroll, of course, presenting this item. Secretary, I appreciate you working close with Mr. Kroll on this. Okay, seeing no further discussion on this discussion item, I will now move to other matters. And Secretary Nicholson, I believe you did have another matter that you would like to bring up. You're recognized, sir.
Yes, thank you. And Director Ruscia and I are the only two members of the Jewish community, as far as I'm aware, on the board of directors. And as Director Rusha reminded me, this is Jewish Heritage Month. And last night, and as I should say, as I mentioned to the board and circulated an email earlier, this month or early last month, Holocaust awareness was just around the corner a little bit. Last night, two members of my community were gunned down in DC in a hate-motivated attack because they were members of the Jewish community. And I bring that up in this situation only because it was a stark reminder for me as a public official of the vulnerability that we face in this moment. And I would just say that, I hope that we're all asking ourselves and sort of looking out for in a time where violence can, as we know in this state, come from anywhere. Looking out for our own safety and looking out for each other, because it was made very clear to me in a very stark and way yesterday that safety is not always there, and that there's not. Sorry, this is harder for me than it usually is. And just to recognize the risks to vulnerable communities of so many types that we face in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for your words. Yeah, I know this is very, very much a very difficult topic, and I do greatly appreciate serving on a board with so many directors who are, always heartfelt for, tragedies such as the ones that happened last night, and always there protecting vulnerable communities. And it is an honor to serve with all of you, all 14 of you, of always caring for the most vulnerable communities and always caring from a transit perspective, and a perspective where we're always having to look out for people. So I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, and our hearts go out to the community. First Vice Chair O'Keefe.
So Director Nicholson knows I'm not Jewish, my wife and children are, and I'm not trying to make anyone feel worse about this situation, but when we were out doing our meetings on the Hill with APTA, there was a education outreach, meet with your congressional member, a massive fly-in of people talking about issues related to, our Jewish population. And they were happy and peaceful and appropriately engaging their members of Congress. And that was the backdrop that last night came against.
Thank you, First Vice Chair O'Keefe. Director Rusha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did not have any planned comments for other matters. I just wanted to say thank you to you and to First Vice Chair O'Keefe for your comments and support. And now I'm getting choked up. What happened last night was a hate crime, and it's not easy to call it out. And I just wanted to say thank you to Secretary Nicholson for showing some vulnerability, and also noting that whether it's our community or another community, it is good to check in with each other. And I don't have anything eloquent to say. I just wanted to recognize the words that were already said. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Rusha. And again, I know everyone on this board and everyone who is part of this agency, our hearts go out whenever, tragedies such as this happen. And, and it, I again, just want to thank you all for serving with such folks that are so empathetic towards, caring about others and any tragedies such as this that occur, unfortunately, in this world. And I think it's strongest always to say, love will always conquer hate in the long run of this. So with that being said, any other matters at this time? Okay, well, greatly appreciate all of you today. I did want to let you know, our next meeting is going to be scheduled June 18th at 11:15 a.m. At this time, we're slated to hold discussions of the following: board office budget, as always. We will have our government relations report from Mr. Davies. Mr. Kroll.
Just one thing to point out on that meeting is going to fall on a Wednesday. So that is a Wednesday in June. The subsequent day, the Thursday, which we would normally hold the meeting on, is actually an RTD administrative holiday in recognition of Juneteenth.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll. I appreciate you saying that. So that will be Wednesday, the 18th. That will have that meeting. Okay, I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Moved.
All right, I have O'Keefe as
Second.
okay. We are now adjourned as of 12:21 p.m. I hope you all enjoy the